Hi, make sure you check Blackboard for updates on all your classes. Starting next week, you'll be responsible for doing the lab work on the Biology 111 Master Lab site. So look for emails from Elizabeth Mays in regard to lab work and emails from me about lecture. Just a short video summarize Chapter 35 on animal reproduction for you. These slides are of course on Blackboard for you, and I want to make certain I give you a little bit of content here on this low quality video. I understand. All right, so as always, asexual reproduction is mitosis, as we see with the aphids here. And then this side, two ladybugs are reproducing sexually. Okay, so asexual reproduction, A in front of a word means not sex. So they're basically, cells are dividing by mitosis, making exact copies of all those insects. Ladybugs are going to have some diversity due to sexual reproduction. Alright, so they are able to adapt to a changing environment. If there was a member of one of these ladybugs families that had were all black or all red, there might be some advantage to that coloration if those alleles, those genes, passed on. Alright, we've seen this before in Chapter 9 on meiosis, and maybe in the mitosis chapter. We have meiosis, production of gametes, which are sperm and egg. Sperm and egg coming together, well, that is called fertilization, and it creates the first cell of the new organism, here the zygote, and that becomes the baby. The first cell, the zygote, divides by mitosis. Sperm and egg, oocytes, are egg cells. Sperm are produced by meiosis. Alright, so diploid versus haploid is important in this chapter, and in the meiosis chapter, as we saw. Haploid, well, that number is half the diploid number. The haploid starts with H and half starts with H. So in humans, haploid cells like sperm and egg are, well, they're 23 chromosomes. And the zygote is the sperm and the egg coming together, so 23 in each of those cells. 23 in the sperm, 23 in the egg, produces those nuclei combined to become the zygote, and that has 46 chromosomes. Alright, this is mitotic cleavage, the only type of cleavage that we talk about in biology class, but this is basically rapid mitosis, from one cell to two cells, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, and so on. Alright, we'll see this quite a few times. Direct development is, well, small turtle turning into a larger turtle. In the caterpillar, which turns into the beautiful butterfly, we have a metamorphosis that occurs, and that is indirect development, like a tadpole to a frog, two stages that look completely different. So we'll have this on exam 5 as well, but it is one of those subjects that comes back again as well. Alright, the clicker questions. What is the role of the zygote in the life cycle, in a sexual life cycle? It is the first cell of the new offspring, meaning the baby. And it divides and divides and divides. Alright, so we take a look at, a closer look at male meiosis. And this, this chapter 35, is a large one. There's 95 slides here. If we look at male meiosis occurs in the testes. ES if it's plural, IS for singular. We need to know this organ and that it produces the hormone testosterone, which produces male characteristics as well as the sperm. Alright, so this slide basically shows us that we have to not lose cells in the testes. It shows us that mitosis occurs first, and then meiosis occurs next. The sperm itself has a long tail called a flagellum, and then a cap that has proteins that match up to the proteins that are in the oocyte, the egg cell. And basically, it's a propulsion unit for the cell nucleus, which is in the head of the sperm. All right, epididymis is where the sperm are stored after they're produced in the testis. The vas deferens is the tube that takes the sperm to the duct that goes through the prostate and where the seminal gland adds its fluid. The vas deferens is what's cut in a vasectomy, so the sperm can't get out. The seminal vesicle adds its fluid, so does the prostate, and then the sperm are propelled out the urethra. Urethra is also shared with the urine. All right, so the prostate is a gland that contributes to the semen. The sperm are just a small percentage of the semen. The prostate and seminal glands produce most of the fluid. Ejaculation is a word that no one likes, but it is the exiting of the sperm from the urethra. Now this slide is pretty important, slide 24 here. The hormones that are involved in the male reproductive cycle, hormonal cycle, are also the same ones that are produced in the female body. So it all starts just outside, just in the brain, structure in the brain called the hypothalamus, and it sends a hormone called GnRH to the pituitary gland, which upon stimulation from the hypothalamus by GnRH secretes two hormones, FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, both of which contribute to the production of the sperm, but it is LH that produces testosterone, which helps FSH to produce sperm, to signal the production of sperm. All right, so LH, once again, stimulates testosterone production. And a review of the anatomy here before we go further into the hormones. No clickers at home, no clickers in the classroom, but we still have these questions. So sperm pathway of the sperm, basically it's asking for the last in the sequence, which would be the urethra there. All right, so I think we described the pathway in the pictures that we saw, and we're on to the female hormonal cycle, which produces oocytes or egg cells. So production of the oocytes, one oocyte at a time, and three things called polar bodies. All of this occurs as meiosis. Female meiosis occurs in the ovaries. Okay? Usually one side or the other. If both sides are producing eggs at the same time, then twins will run in that family. So the uterine tube is the tube that goes to the uterus. It also has other names, oviduct and fallopian tube, but I like uterine tube because it's the tube that goes to the uterus. Uterus is the womb. It's where the zygote will implant as a cell structure called a blastocyst, and then become the embryo and the fetus. The fetus is the baby, which would be born. All right, so the eggs in the ovaries eventually get to the uterus, but a lot happens before that. So this is a pretty important picture. Let me zoom in here if I can a little bit. I know this is kind of bouncing a bit, but I'll fix that. This is my first attempt at this. All right, so the ovarian cycle is the cycle that occurs in the ovaries. This cycle starts with, primary oocytes, basically, and then a different cell type called follicle cells here. So So follicle cells are the cells that are around the egg cell. And they start out as one layer, and then 2 layers, and then 3 layers, and you can call them, the primary, secondary, and tertiary follicles. Tertiary follicle would be a mature follicle. It's got a bunch of fluid building up, and that fluid creates the pressure that's needed to rupture the follicle and release the egg. And that is that word that is releasing of the egg cell is called ovulation. Alright, so ovulation is different than fertilization. Ovulation has to happen first, release of the egg cell from the ovaries. The follicle cells that stay behind, there's some that stay behind, they become a structure called the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is a structure that starts producing a lot of progesterone. Progesterone starts with P, and pregnancy starts with P, so PPP, progesterone prepares for pregnancy. If we wanted to Dr. Seuss that a little bit. Okay, so there might be a polar body with the egg, but those polar bodies go away. It's the egg cell that has all the cytoplasm, and it continues to when it's released, continues on, and then will be fertilized by the sperm. Those 2 nuclei, 23 chromosomes in each, will come together. So that's basically what happens inside the ovaries. And the thing to understand about meiosis is in females, it stops in meiosis part 1, stops in meiosis part 2. After fertilization, it stops again, and it only completes fertilization when it is fertilized. Okay, male meiosis is continuous, continuous, no stopping. Continuous production of sperm in males. Females, they have some stops along the way. All right, so the cells of the follicle are around the egg cell. They're different cells. A primary oocyte becomes a secondary oocyte after ovulation, release from the ovaries. Release happens into the uterine tubes, and that's usually where fertilization happens. Those follicle cells that stay behind in the ovary are then called the corpus luteum. All right, polar bodies, those are cells that, there's 3 of them, and they give all of their cytoplasm to the oocyte, to the egg cell. So without the cytoplasm, those cells die away, and only is left is a large egg cell with enough cytoplasm to divide rapidly by mitosis, or cleavage, which we talked about earlier on in this. All right, so the secondary oocyte is stopped and only completes if fertilization occurs. That's this slide 39. All right, so you can go back through these slides on your own. They're numbered, so I'm try to use the slide numbers a little bit more. All right, this slide 40. This is female meiosis, oogenesis, genesis of oocytes, and it starts with a germinating cell, a germ cell, that divides by mitosis and then goes through meiosis. If it didn't divide by mitosis, then we'd lose cells in the ovaries would shrink, so would the testes, and that can't happen if we want reproduction to happen on a regular basis. All right, the female anatomy is a little easier. We have the ovary, we have the uterine tube, and in between there's these finger-like structures. Let me do that a little better. These little hand-like structures called fimbriae that catch the egg cell after it's released or ovulated from the ovaries. Sweep it into the uterine tube to bring it to the uterus. So if the egg is not fertilized in the uterine tubes, then the egg cell is lost, along with the lining of the uterus called the endometrium, which we need to know that word for sure, and that is called menses or menstruation. The menstrual period ends in menstruation or loss of the endometrium, which is the lining of the uterus. The cervix is the opening of the uterus. That's important. We looked at that earlier in the semester. for cervical cancer, HPV virus affects those cells, and it's sexually transmitted. So there's a vaccine for that. You can get that vaccine, prevent yourself from getting cervical cancer later on in life. All right, the vagina is the birth canal. After the baby exits the cervix, the vagina is the next passageway for the developed baby. All right, this image here on slide 44 shows the ovary here, and then an ovulated egg cell, sperm that are fertilizing that egg cell here, and then a zygote is formed. And that zygote goes through day 1, day 2, day 3 of cleavage, rapid mitosis, to become a blastocyst, and that blastocyst is the cell mass that implants in the uterus. Okay, and at the end of day 5, which is the end of day 5 for most. So the blastocyst has two parts: an inner cell mass, which will become the embryo, and then an outer group of cells. The outside cells are the trophoblast, and they will become the chorion, which will then become the placenta. Okay, so that's the placenta there, but this diagram is not labeled with trophoblast. One later on, I think, is. So there it is, underlined blastocyst, implants in the uterus, in the lining of the uterus, in the endometrium, which has been thickened by progesterone. Progesterone preps for pregnancy, basically thickens that membrane, the endometrium. And I underline and I define a lot of these things in the Chapter 35 objectives on Blackboard. The one that says defined, Exam 3, Chapter 35, objectives for Chapter 35 for Exam 3, defined. I have a lot of this stuff underlined that you need to know for online Exam 3 and online Quiz 3 first, which will be only 10 questions. The exam will have some more, but some of the same questions more than likely. All right, so once again, the ovarian cycle happens in the ovaries, menstrual cycle happens in the uterus, uterine cycle, menstrual cycle, the same thing. That's underlined later on as well. So the hormones involved are the same. Hypothalamus secretes GnRH, which stimulates the pituitary to release FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone. And FSH is what stimulates the follicle cells to divide. Now the difference between males and females is that LH isn't released from the pituitary gland. It is stored, and it is stored till about day 14. And when LH is released, then that is the trigger for ovulation of the egg from the ovaries. All right, so FSH stimulates the follicle cells to do what they do, which is produce estrogen. So the more follicle cells that we have, if they divide by mitosis, stimulated by FSH, then they'll secrete estrogen. If there's more of them, then we'll have more estrogen. And as that estrogen level rises, that's what the hypothalamus senses and then triggers the release of LH. Okay, so the ovarian cycle is everything that happens in the ovaries. It ends in the ovulation of the egg, and you can see that there's a peak in the blood of LH released from the pituitary gland, the anterior part of the pituitary gland. That spike in the blood is what triggers ovulation here. Okay. And once again, these cells that are left behind in the ovary, these cells here, become the corpus luteum. All right, so that's the ovarian cycle. LH and FSH are involved. Those hormones are involved in the ovarian cycle. The uterine cycle prepares the uterus for pregnancy, thickening of the lining or the endometrium here. And progesterone is mainly responsible for the thickening of the endometrium. Estrogen is important as well. It also contributes a little bit, but its main job, as it increases here, estrogen, it's going to trigger the release of LH at the same time as it increases. All right, so about a 28-day cycle on both in the ovaries and the menstrual cycle. This is what happens in both places. All right. Rising FSH stimulates follicle cells to divide. Rising estrogen triggers LH to be released. LH is what causes ovulation of the egg cell, the oocyte, from the ovaries. Alright, so rupturing of the follicle, that's release of the egg cell of the oocyte, and that happens due to LH increase. Corpus luteum are once again the follicle cells that stay behind in the ovaries. They start producing large amounts of progesterone, and progesterone causes thickening of the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. All right, no fertilization of the egg cell, and then these hormones drop off, and the menstruation occurs. Now, birth control pills are basically, they keep the progesterone and estrogen levels. That's what they are. Synthetic versions of those, and they keep those levels high. So if these levels don't increase, they stay constant, then there won't be any ovulation, and that's the idea. If no egg release, no fertilization can occur. Okay, but this is, according to our textbook, this information is pretty accurate. Abstinence, the first thing on the list, is 100% effective if you do it, which is, well, not that easy to do, but it doesn't cost anything. That's the advantage. And it is, if it's done, there's 0 pregnancies occurring. But the other methods of birth control here, you can see, are less effective. And you have, the pill down here, hormone supplements. You have between 2 and 9 babies, 2 and 9% babies born while on the pill. The levels of estrogens can fluctuate by the body due to all kinds of things, from stress to any number of things. So it can happen that you can have a dip in estrogen, and then when you take the pill the next time, it goes up, and that will trigger LH to be released to trigger ovulation. So the only true way not to get pregnant when you don't want to, or timing is everything, is abstinence. We just talked about how hormones regulate ovulation, a whole bunch. Now, STDs are called STIs now, sexually transmitted infections. You'll see this on billboards around Peoria, and the way to prevent these is, well, first abstinence, and secondly, some sort of barrier. Condoms are effective at preventing these viruses, bacteria, and protists. Even yeast infections like fungi are transmitted sexually. All right, to prevent the spread of STIs and really any bacteria or virus is, social distancing, abstinence, in this case, condoms. Those things are effective in sexually transmitted infections. All right, so the egg is only viable for 24 hours after ovulation, and the sperm needs to fertilize it within that window. Now realize the sperm can be there for up to 5 days, and so you could have had sex the week, 5 days prior, and then get pregnant. So that's an important thing to realize. During fertilization, the sperm nucleus combines with the egg nucleus in this way, and then that fertilized egg, which is called a zygote, goes through cleavage, a mitotic cleavage, and which is rapid mitosis. All right, the blastocyst, after day 5, implants in the uterus. The outer layer of blastocyst cells. And don't worry, next video I'm going to not hold this thing so it doesn't bounce like this. But the trophoblast will become the chorion, which will become the placenta. I know there's better ways to do this. I just have old technology here. All right, the inner cell mass will become the embryo. Blastocyst implants in the uterus. Implantation happens after day 5. And you can tell if there's a zygote form because zygotes secrete this hormone called HCG. Human chorionic gonadotropin is what pregnancy tests detect. Okay, slide 73 here, HCG. Now, it ends up in the urine, and if you urinate on that pregnancy stick, you can tell whether there's a zygote or a embryo, both of which produce this HCG. Okay. All right. After implantation, the embryo forms. The embryo is the embryonic disc are basically 3 layers of divided cells from the original zygote that flatten out. That's why it's called a disc. And they endoderm, mesoderm, ectoderm. Mesoderm's the easiest. It's the middle one. It starts with M and it becomes muscle. Ecto, that's outside. That outside our body is the skin and nervous system's connected to that. And then endoderm is everything inside, and so that's those major organ systems from respiratory to digestive to etc. All right, so we can see here the extra embryonic membranes. We've been talking about the chorion becoming the placenta. The amnion becomes the amniotic sac. The yolk sac doesn't last in humans. It does in chickens, the yolk. The allantois, well, we'll get to that because we have a slide for each one of these. All right, so the extra membranes of the embryo, extra embryonic membranes or extra membranes in the embryo, we need to know all 4 of those. The yolk sac, we need to know what they do. It produces blood cells. Allantois gives rise to the umbilical blood vessels. Amnion becomes the amniotic sac and fluid, and the chorion becomes the placenta. The villi are just part of the chorion. Alright, so placenta is pretty important. It's a connection between the mother and baby. It's not a physical connection, but oxygen and nutrients are exchanged there from the blood of the mother to the blood of the baby. Not everything can cross the placenta. Some viruses can, some viruses cannot. Not sure about COVID-19, or, well, that's the condition due to the virus, coronavirus 19. We don't want to talk about that right now. It's kind of a sore subject for all of us. The umbilical cord is a connection between the placenta and the baby. Now, organ formation happens by the 3rd week of development, and most females haven't missed their period, so they don't know they're pregnant, and the baby's organs are developing, so that's a pretty critical period. So what you do on a regular basis makes a difference in terms of things like teratogens that cause birth defects. The notochord we'll talk about in chapter 21 again, but it will become the vertebral bones. The neural tube will become the spinal cord, and by the 4th week, the heart begins beating. So that's pretty powerful. Sex differences happen between weeks 7 and 9. In an ultrasound, you need somebody experienced to be able to tell the difference between a clitoris and a penis. SRY gene on the Y chromosome is what causes gonads to become testes. Week 9, which is 2 months pretty much, just after 2 months, is the fetal stage. Embryo becomes a fetus. And after about 38 weeks, we have the baby ready to be born. And the weight of the baby will cause pressure on the cervix of the uterus, which will cause oxytocin hormone to be released, which will cause uterine contractions. Okay? If we remember from chapter 1, positive feedback, our number 1 example was childbirth. and change causes more change. That's positive feedback homeostasis. And change causes more contraction, which causes more contractions until the baby's born. Fertilization, again, gets mixed up with ovulation, I guess, because they both end in TION. Fertilization occurs usually in the uterine tubes. Now, teratogens, pretty important. These things, well, basically everything on this list, from too many vitamins, to over-the-counter drugs that you get, to narcotic drugs, to nicotine, to alcohol, to things in our environment, seem to cause birth defects in the first trimester, the first 3 months of development. Okay, so possibly pregnant females need to avoid all of these things to avoid damage to the organs of the baby, especially the brain. All right, hope this helped. Next one will be better.